and compulsions. We do know, however, that they abolished the death sentence at exactly the same time the United States was reinstituting the death sentence in this country. Maximum penalty in their courts is 30 years in jail. They released thousands of the hated National Guard that they had in their custody, saying that they would not jail anyone for having belonged to an organization. They would have to be convicted of individual crimes. They launched a literacy campaign to teach each Nicaraguan to read and write. They set out to build 2,500 clinics so each Nicaraguan would have access to some kind of medical treatment. These are all things that Somoza, the dictator, backed up by the United States, had not gotten around to doing. And they launched the most ambitious land reform campaign in the history of Central America. And they did this by maintaining a free enterprise economy. If you owned land and you were working it, you kept it. They were taking the lands that Somoza and his family and the people who had fled had stolen or taken or gotten, and they were turning those lands back to the people in different forms and cooperatives, feeling their way as they went, making mistakes as they went, trying this solution and that one, but with the purpose of getting the land back to the people so people would work land, own land, relate to land, and profit from the land that they worked on in their own country. And they brought something totally new, I believe, to the modern world, which is a unity between Christianity and Marxism, of asserting that the church should have, if it has any purpose and justification at all, it's that it should be the church of the people, the church of the poor, not the church of the oligarchy and the rich and the wealthy. I've been in Tomas Borges' office, the Minister of Interior, and counted on the wall the 25 Catholic icon collector items that he's put on the wall there. If he had, I counted them twice, there were exactly 25. That infers that he must have others at home, and these were the selected ones that he put on, that he chose to display on his wall. And until today, despite this continued attack, war is what the World Court called it, that we've waged on Nicaragua, Nicaragua has yet to commit one act of war against the United States. But instead of joining them in building the healthiest, most dynamic, most enthusiastic country in Central America, we spent over $1 billion during the 80s to destabilize the country. We set out systematically to create conditions where the farmer could not get his produce to market, where children couldn't go to school, where women were terrified inside their homes as well as outside their homes of being attacked, where the hospitals were treating wounded people instead of sick people, where government administration grinds to a halt, where the trucks don't run, the bridges are blown, the salaries aren't paid, you can't get a driver's license, all the infrastructure breaks down, and of course eventually international capital is scared away and the country plunges into chaos and bankruptcy. We created the Contra program beginning in about 1981. There was a Newsweek article following up after there was plenty of documentation on this on November 7 and 8, 1982 that said, here we go again. We've done this before. It's been a mistake before. We're going into Nicaragua. Once again, we're supporting the wrong side, Newsweek noted. It said that we had elected to support the only truly evil, totally unacceptable faction in the Nicaraguan equation, that being the remnants of Somoza's hated National Guard. But using Argentine trainers at first and then eventually CIA mercenaries, we armed and directed this small army from bases mostly in Honduras to attack in Nicaragua and destabilize. Systematically, they were blowing up granaries, sawmills, bridges, government offices, schools, health centers, mines, mining roads, ambushing trucks, raiding farms and villages. We have massive documentation of all this because the country, as I said, was kept open. For the first few years, CBS, NBC, ABC, BBC, CBC all had crews down there in residence, and when there would be atrocities, they would rush up and film them. We also had what totaled eventually dozens of thousands of witnesses from this country and Canada and Europe and Australia going down and living right in the towns and villages with the people, and when there were atrocities, rushing out to film and photograph and document them. Like I say, massive documentation. There's also been direct U.S. military involvement in all of this. U.S. military mining harbors, overflights, underwater demolitions teams going in to blow up things in the ports. There's been assassination of religious leaders, teachers, health workers, elected officials, government administrators. CBS, NBC, others have footage of this. The America's Watch, the Witness for Peace, we've managed to come up with lists of the names of hundreds and hundreds of leaders who've been assassinated down there. We also have admission of this program by President Ronald Reagan on national television in the debates with Walter Mondale, because an assassination manual that we were using to train these people, the Contras with, was brought to the attention of the press, and it became a big issue and led to a change, a slight change, in the politics in Congress towards the Contra program. And President Reagan said this was the work of the CIA station chief in Tegucigalpa, and I can assure you the CIA was not appreciative of him, with that particular slip-up. Because one, it attributed, assassinations, a policy of... So the media went to the White House the following Monday and said, did that mean that there had been a change in U.S. policy against assassinations? And the White House, playing, doublespeak, said, well, no, not really, because in our opinion, assassination applies to world leaders only. When you're killing religious leaders or regional leaders, it's not assassination, it's just killing. Terror has been a part of this program. Raw terror, as raw as anything that happens in the Middle East or elsewhere. These Contras have been going into villages. They've been hauling families out with other members of the family forced to watch. They've been castrating fathers, gang raping mothers, slashing off their breasts, again, while the children are forced to watch. 22,000 is the figure the New York Times gave the last time I counted as the number of people killed in this thing. And again, this is nobody's propaganda. This is documented and condemned by the World Court, by the Presbyterian Church, by the Methodist Church, by broad segments of the Catholic Church, and again by these dozens of thousands of witnesses who've gone down from other countries to see for themselves. As you recall, President Reagan remained throughout unapologetic for this activity. He took pride in saying, quote, I'm a Contra. He took pride in saying that these people were the moral equivalent of his founding fathers. And of course, George Bush has never missed a chance to identify himself with these Contras. Again, read for yourself. Read Contra Terror by Reed Brody, former Assistant Attorney General of New York State. Read The Contras by Dieter Ike. Read With the Contras by Christopher Dickey, a so-called moderate journalist representing the Washington Post in Central America. Read Witness for Peace, What We Have Seen and Heard. Read The Lawyers Commission on Human Rights. Read The Violations of War on Both Sides by the America's Watch. Read The Mosquito Indians in Nicaragua. Read Washington's War on Nicaragua by Holly Sklar. Or go to Nicaragua and see for yourself. You have to get a visa now, but there's not one person in this room who cannot find a way in the coming summer, for example, or during the winter even, to raise enough money to go to Nicaragua and see for yourself. And I urge you to do so because we have a unique situation. It may be 10 or 20 years before there'll be another covert action which is so open that you can be sure of the facts, you can have absolute knowledge of what your government is doing there, and you can go inside the country and circulate and see the effects of our destabilization policy on the targeted country. Of course, throughout these years, there's been a relentless propaganda program to discredit the Sandinistas. We've labeled the Sandinistas as totalitarian dictators. We said at first that they were flowing arms into El Salvador. We claimed when they put together a military machine to defend their country from this attack, we claimed they were building a war machine that, quote, threatened the stability of all of Central America, without noting that they did not have strategic weapons. They did not have tanks and bombers that could, in fact, attack other countries. We charged them with censorship, specifically closing down La Prensa newspaper, and it was several years after we were crowing about this censorship by the government before it came out that La Prensa was on the United States government payroll. The National Endowment for Democracy, using U.S. government funds, was subsidizing La Prensa as our propaganda arm right in the capital of that country while we brutally destabilized that country. And of course, in 1984, we launched a vigorous campaign to discredit their elections. Now, they had elections that were supervised and witnessed by United Nations groups and other groups, who said that they were as fair as any elections they had seen in Central America in many, many years. And these elections were quite an embarrassment to Ronald Reagan, who was then the champion of the Contra program in this country, and I'm sure to George Bush today, because they were quite a bit more democratic than the elections that we held in this country during the same year. I suggest you go to the Covert Action Information Bulletin number 25 from the summer of 1986. There are later versions of the bulletin being sold outside tonight, for an article by Mr. Michael Parenti discussing the democracy in Nicaragua. They had 7 parties with candidates running for election. We had 2. They turned out 75.4% of the vote. We turned out 53% of the vote in this country. They voted directly. We voted for electors who selected our leaders. They passed a law that every legitimate party would have an equal amount of money to spend for campaign purposes. In this country, if you can raise more money, you can buy more television time, you have a much better chance of winning the election. In fact, in terms of direct voter participation in this republic, we are not a democracy, we're a republic. In terms of voter representation, we're rated 75th in the world, just before South Africa, which is 76th. Another element of propaganda that we were slamming them with was claiming that the Sandinistas were smuggling drugs to finance their revolution. We staged scenes paying the pilot Barry Seals, plea bargaining a deal with him to land a plane in Nicaragua to kick some bales of marijuana out on the runway to photograph by satellite so President Reagan could put them on television saying this proves they're smuggling drugs. In fact, the record is out massively clear. The Contra program was smuggling drugs. I won't go into the details right here now. In the question and answer we will. I'll mention them later. But we had the Senator Kerry investigation. We had also intensive investigation by our media. We have dozens of cases where people in the Contra program, including Adolfo Colero's brother-in-law, caught smuggling cocaine into this country using the national security shield or passes, using telephone numbers from the White House to get themselves cleared when FBI or DEA officers would come down on them. We claim the Sandinistas were responsible for terrorism in Central America. And this case, of course, has never been made. Meanwhile, however, the United States has been supporting with literally billions of dollars the activities of death squads that were slaughtering people brutally in countries like El Salvador and Guatemala. And we've been blaming the Sandinistas for the misery in Nicaragua. And the country is miserable. They say no high. We don't have everything. There are shortages of everything. The country is suffering. But U.S. representatives go down there and have a look and come back and go on television and say, you won't believe the place. It's the most miserable country I've ever visited. The Sandinistas have not been able to manage it. Look what happens when you have a Marxist government. To be honest, obviously, they would go down and say, our stated purpose back since 1982 was to break the Nicaraguan economy. We spent $1 billion destabilizing the country to break its economy. Now here are my snapshots of the results of our successful program to break their economy. Of course, they don't do that because they're playing propaganda, because they're not being honest. The country is miserable. It's not the fault of the Sandinistas. It was the purpose of our Contra program. And then there's the Soviet threat. President Reagan saying all those years, that we were having Soviets in our own backyard. He used to like to say there were Russians flying airplanes in this hemisphere, meaning into Nicaragua, for the first time in all of history. And like much of what he said, his mind didn't work clearly on all 3 cylinders at best. Like much of what he said, this was not accurate. Anyone who would think for a minute would note that Aeroflot has been flying into Canada, into Mexico, into Latin America, into New York City for 30 or 40 years on a daily basis, not to mention flying in and out of Cuba continuously. So the statement simply